It's my real great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Bob Gray. Bob Gray is a fire ecologist, and there's a great need for fire ecologists. Over the past couple of years, we've seen a tremendous increase in fire activity. And Bob is the go-to guy. If you listen to CBC at all, you have heard Bob on the radio because his opinion is so valued. Bob is a consultant, but he also has a position at the Wenatchee Forest Center. And today he's going to talk about fire. He's going to talk about the, I suppose, future of fire management. So please join me in welcoming Bob.
Thank you very much, Lachlan, and thanks to the students that I just met with the last hour. Lots of really interesting ideas going on, and you guys have got a really good young research program going on here. And I wanted to put a plug in. And I mentioned to the students in the room that there is research dollars coming down the pipe for wildland fire. There'll be a federal pot of money being developed, and there will also be a provincial pot of money developed next spring. So that's good news for us to do much more research in the province. So I've given this talk already once, a couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, in Penticton, and the question came up about, is this the new normal? And I think the Premier made that statement in Burns Lake this year, sometime this summer. And it really isn't, because it's shifting, it's constantly changing. As atmospheric levels of carbon go up, we're having to rejig the models to determine what that means, what's going to happen because of that increased temperature in the atmosphere. So there's two parts of this. The first part is it's top-down and climate weather driven. And then the second part of this is the bottom-up fuels and vegetation. And those two combined influence fire behavior across the landscape. This is structured for as much statistically as possible to BC and Canada. There's some data here that comes from Western North America. If we want, we can talk about what's happening in California right now, but I'm going to structure as much of this as I can around BC. So our climate models suggest that we're about 1.1 degrees C above where we were in 1850. And you can see that this is a great graph, which was produced a couple days ago. But starting in the industrial era, we saw an increase above the natural levels, and it increased a little bit more, not a whole lot, and then it really starts to crank it up here. And the big fear is that 1.5 degrees C, which starts to have some pretty significant impacts on our ability to survive on this planet. The idea through management is to arrest that 1.5 C before we hit the year 2030. And I don't know if we're going to make it. So that 1.11 degrees C is a global temperature average, but as you can see that it's not the same everywhere. So throughout most of Canada, we're already above that 1.11 degrees C above baseline data. And in parts of Canada, we're way above it. So right, here in the Yukon and parts of Northwest Territories, we're at about 3 degrees above that level. So we're already starting to see the significant impacts here with longer fire seasons and larger burned area. Down here, we're already above that as well. And the models projecting out to 2041 to 2070, we're looking at down in here, probably 2 to 2.2 degrees above where we're at right now, which is 1.1. So we'll likely be 4 degrees C above the baseline data. And we're going to see some differences in precipitation patterns as well. So these gray areas will likely see a reduction in precip, and these lighter green to darker green areas, an increase in precipitation. And I'll talk about what kind of form that precipitation is likely going to be in a minute here. So with that increase in temperature in the atmosphere, we're going to start to see some cascading effects. And one of these is a later start to the winter snow and earlier snow melt. Warmer winters and reduced snowpack. So if you look across the seasons, the biggest impacts are the winter. We're going to see very low late season water flows. And that's going to have a big impact on drought and a big impact on suppression. So that water that we need in those ponds and reservoirs and lakes and rivers, at a time when we have increased fire behavior and fire activity, a lot of those places will be dry. We won't have access to that water. So we're going to see changes in temperature and relative humidity. We're already seeing warmer daytime temperatures. Most significantly, higher minimum temperatures at night. So we're not seeing recovery at night. We're seeing those high daytime temperatures basically extending through the evening and not cooling off. And also much lower daytime RH. California, I think it was on Tuesday, the 19 degrees during the day was extending into about 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. It only dropped down to about 15 outside the campfire. And the RH was about 50 at 8 o'clock, and by 9 o'clock in the morning it was at 8. So we're seeing those manifesting themselves throughout Western North America. So part of the problem too is the lazy jet stream. I was explaining this to the students a few minutes ago. So what's happened with the warming of the Arctic is there's no longer such a significant temperature gradient between the Arctic and the tropics. When it was a stronger gradient, it actually added boost and heft to the jet stream. It provided a temperature gradient that gave it speed. And it was able to move weather systems along much quicker. What's happened with this basically warming, there's not much of a temperature gradient now. And so basically these high pressure systems park in one place and they don't move for 10 days to 2 weeks at a time. And then they'll move on. The next one comes in at parks as well. And that's the consequence. So we get these systems, we've got large smoldering fires producing a lot of smoke, and they don't leave, they persist. A week, 10 days, 2 weeks. This is Calgary this summer. And that's Edmonton. And 50 micrograms per cubic meter is basically the human health level. Anything above that is starting to have some significant impacts on human health. And there were days in there where it was hitting 180 for days at a time. We're seeing a higher incidence of lightning activity. So this is the 5-year trend line. Back in 2003, about 50,000 strikes over the summer. We're up to almost 120,000 strikes. Some research that was produced in the spring suggests that with every 1 degree C global air temperature increase, there'll be a 12% corresponding increase in lightning. I know, this story gets worse and worse all the time. I have a very depressing job.
That's all right. I'm reading Maud Barlow's Blue Gold. So
Well, you're in the same boat. We'll go commit suicide together.
I'm going to call him to shoot myself.
There you go. Less precipitation during the fire season, but when that precipitation comes, it's likely going to be in these higher convective events. And unfortunate side of that is if it does land on top of these burned areas, because of hydrophobic soils, we're going to see increased erosion, and we're already seeing that in some places. Much more of this, the dry lightning type of precipitation patterns coming out. So, higher incidence of strong wind events, and some of this has to do with frontal passages, dry cold fronts and such. So this is an example of what typically happens with wind direction and wind speed. When we have an existing fire, we've got southwest winds pushing it to the north. And this is a dry cold front coming through. So as the cold front passes, it changes the direction and speed of the fire. And if there's no one on the fire, that's okay. But unfortunately what happens is we often put people in the way and we don't see exactly when these frontal passages come through. This is the Yarnell Hill fire from 2012. The 19 firefighters were killed. So they were actioning the fire out here, and they had south winds of 24 miles per hour at 3. By 5 o'clock, the cold front passage had come through, no precipitation, slightly cooler temperature, but the winds had jumped from 24 to 42. And what was the flank of the fire they were working on now became the head. And they were hit with 42-mile-an-hour winds. They couldn't escape the fire, and 19 firefighters were killed. We've seen more episodes of this type of pattern in the last couple of years. So 2015, just south of the border, was the Carlton Complex fire. And that started outside the village of Twist in central Washington. There were 2 lightning strikes here and here. And in an 8-hour period, they did a 33-mile run. And it jumped to Columbia. That was burning through mostly grass and ponderosa pine and antelope river brush. Last year, 2017, the Keno fire that burnt through Waterton Lakes National Park did a 17K run overnight. There was another dry cold front that came through, no precipitation, slightly cooler temperature, but change in wind direction and significant increase in wind speed. This last year, the Meacham fire, which threatened the village of Kimberly, it did a 17K run in one period. And a number of those fires, if you were watching Modus last summer, the fires up in northwestern BC, there were a lot of them that had that classic cigarette burn pattern, just a long straight burn. Well, that's basically a wind-driven, cold front-driven fire event. And we're just seeing more of those dry, cold front periods coming through. You'd watch the news in the summer, and there'd be a forecast that there's a low off the coast of Alaska. It's kind of swirling in toward BC. It's got some precip 5 days out. Well, 3 days out, it's gone from 80% chance of precip to 60%. 2 days out, it's dropped to 40%. 1 day out, 10% chance of precip. But strong winds are still coming with it. Longer fire seasons. This graph down here from Pacific Forestry Center, or in our can, is looking at basically continued emissions increases and when does basically where the early season start dates and how long the fire season. This is data from Washington, Idaho, Montana, and these are the periods 73 to 82, 83 to 92, and basically we're up to 225 days in some places. Not all of BC, but some parts of BC have already seen an increase in a month or month and a half in fire season. California is now year-round. It's a year-round fire season in California. More frequent, longer, worsening droughts. This is the drought magnitude monitor here. These are baseline conditions. There's lots of blue up in BC. Current, if we do hit that 1.5 degrees C, which is highly likely that we will, we start to see an increase in a specific warming level, the magnitude, the drought magnitude level. If we hit 2 degrees C, which is also highly likely, higher magnitude, and certainly by 3 degrees, we've got some serious problems. And I'll talk about some of the effects of that in a minute. So all of this that's happening also has a big impact on these sort of cyclical weather anomalies that we have, like El Nino. So the forecast right now is we've got a building El Nino for this year, which tends to give us a high correlation of a mild winter, bigger fire season the next year. It's not as spectacularly intense El Nino, but we're also still in the first year of it, and it could intensify as well. And the blob is back. So remember back to the 2014, 2015 winter that was no winter, and that was attributed to this large pool of deep, warm water off the coast. Well, the blob is back. It's not as deep as it was, but it's there. And what it does is it forces a lot of these systems up and around, and we don't get a whole lot of precip. I just took a look at the 3-month forecast for Western North America, and it's above normal temp, below normal precip for the 3-month period. So that's the top-down side of things. So now we're going to look at what happens on the ground that contributes to fire behavior. Well, reduced soil moisture is going to kill some trees outright, which is certainly happening. And other trees will be weakened, and they'll become vulnerable to insects and diseases. So some recently published research suggests that we'll see 7 to 9 of these significant seedling mortality events within the next about 60, 70 years. I was talking to Lorraine McLaughlin a couple weeks ago at a conference in Williams Lake, and she said that some of the inventory that they've done showed that over 100,000 hectares of seedling mortality from last year's drought. We don't have any numbers from this year yet. Any of you who have driven the Coquihalla and stopped at the new rest area, these are the pine plantations around there. And I've talked to a lot of colleagues, silviculture, and they're writing off whole plantations in the East Kootenays and the southern interior across the province. Really, really high mortality. And in some places, it's not just seedling mortality, but it's also pole size and some mature trees as well. So, and not just on these sort of shallow, bony sites, but in mature forest. And that contributes more fuels. That's part of that argument. With a longer fire season, longer drying, lower humidity, higher temperature, we have live and dead fuels dry out, and they're able to burn earlier and longer. So that means that those early season fires basically the fire digs in, and it's really hard to put out. We have more ecological impact, higher burn severities. That's the impact on the soils, loss of diversity. Those fires are harder to suppress. The heavier the fuel load and the deeper that fire digs in, the harder it is to put it out. We can keep bombing it, but it takes crews on the ground and lots of water to put it out. And more smoke and carbon emissions from all that burning. The last 2 years, BC's wildfire emissions and carbon have vastly exceeded all other emission sources in Canada. I don't have the numbers yet, but they're still working on them. And burned area will increase annually up to a point. So a lot of these previous burn scars will actually start to interrupt fire flow. This is from the tripod fire in East Central Washington in 2006. And the tripod, which is a fire that started down here, and it ran to the north under southwest winds. And it encountered a number of previous fires. So there was the 2003 Isabel fire, there was the Farwell Canyon fire, the 2001 Thunder 30 Mile fire, and Iron Mountain, Thunder Mountain, and then the Forks fire. And you can see the fire basically, as soon as it hit an old fire, it just kind of worked its way around it. So we can, with increased burned area, some of those burn scars will actually start to impede fire flow, except where we have cheatgrass. And where we have cheatgrass, other introduced annual grasses, it'll burn every year. They're looking at places in the Great Basin in Nevada and Utah, and those landscapes are burning every year. And if we have an El Nino, which in the southwest and the central part of the states means a wet winter, it just grows more cheatgrass. So, and our La Nina produces lots of cheatgrass, which then burns with an El Nino the next year. Feedback. Patches of high severity will likely be larger. These are the fires from 2017. So this is the Elephant Hill fire, the Risky Hanceville fire, and this is the Big Plateau fire, 500,000 hectares. And all the red is burn severity. And you can see here the very, very large patches of high burn severity. So that becomes a huge issue for regeneration, and plant propagules have been killed by the fire. And that's kind of what we see in those areas. It's just lots of really high burn severity, lots of big damage on that site. The bigger the area, the harder it is to get those sites rehabilitated. And the reburn will increase in frequency. So this is that site that burns once and then it burns again in a short couple of years. This is from Kootenai National Park. This is Elephant Hill. And this burnt in 1991 as the Spar fire, and it reburnt again in 2012 in the Octopus Mountain fire, and then it reburnt again in 2017. This is a spruce fir lodgepole forest that the underlying fire history work was done a couple of years ago, found a 250-year mean. What now is a 17.5-year mean. And it likely won't produce a forest. So most of the seed rain is gone. We didn't find any seedlings up on the site. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of fuel. So once this regrows an herbaceous fuel bed, it'll burn again. And so until all of this material is consumed, that site will carry fire. And some of these large burned areas are going to fail to reforest. Some of the parts in the western Chilcotin have been planted 3 or 4 times now, and they're not coming back very well. And we've seen that in the Colorado Front Range, which burnt really hot and large burns. Those are ponderosa pine systems. They don't come back very well because pine doesn't produce a lot of seed, and the seed doesn't disperse very far. The Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, the same thing. Big burn areas, ponderosa pine systems. These are lodgepole pine spruce fir systems. There's a lot more, the seed is smaller, it can disperse farther, but these openings are big. That previous burn severity map, those big red patches are really big patches. And so trying to get seed in those areas can be difficult. And we're likely going to see just a decrease in forest area. A lot more shrub, grass, woodland. and patchy forest. I want to switch gears a little bit right now and shift away from the ecological to the economic, to the social and economic. And these fires are costing us a lot of money, not just in suppression. So this is the trend line. It doesn't include last year, but basically this year. But last year we're up around, $550, $600 million was spent on fire, and you can see it's a pretty good trend line. But the research suggests that the indirect and additional costs, that's human health, that's business losses, that's lost property values, that's infrastructure damage the years after the fire due to flooding and erosion, they're 2 to 30 times the suppression cost. So in reality, our last 2 fire seasons, which were about $110 billion in suppression, they're probably closer to $5 to $10 billion in total aggregate. And it's not going to happen right away. It'll happen over time. It'll take a decade for all those bills to come in. And we've seen that in a couple of big fires in the past. So this is the Cerro Grande fire in New Mexico in 2000. This is the fire that was a prescribed burn that ran into Los Alamos and then threatened the nuclear lab. $907 million was the total price tag, and suppression was 27%. This is the Rodeo Chetasky fire, which was also this was a human-caused fire in Arizona in 2002. $316 million price tag, 46% was suppression. The old Grand Prix and Padua complex fires in San Diego in 2000. $1.2 billion was the price tag, and 50% was suppression. This is Fort Mac. $9.9 billion and counting, and suppression was 6% of that.
Who's paying?
We are.
Yeah.
Increased insurance rates, increased building costs. So what can we do to mitigate these effects? Well, this is the really depressing part, is that we can't change the climate. The climate that we have today that's driving the weather and drying out the fuels and giving these large fires is the result of carbon that was emitted 60, 70 years ago. The carbon we emit today is going to impact the weather 50, 60 years down the road. Our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. So what we do today has to be significant to impact their living conditions down the road. One of the things we can do is we can look to historic and contemporary patterns of forest type and structure as guides to greater resilience. So what's happened in the past with natural disturbances that can give us some clues to what we may be able to do to kind of slow down disturbance in the future. We can certainly look at some of these panoramic photographs, and we look at how forest structure has changed, forest types and forest structure, and how those changes came about. A lot of the cases it was due to fire. And it happened across the landscape, not only in dry forest, but also cool forests and high elevation forests as well. We had this very patchy mosaic across the landscape, and those patches functioned as fire hedges and also insect hedges across the landscape. And we can look at some of the historic patterns as we can derive that information through fire history studies and semi-construction studies. This is some research from up in the Caribou. And mean fire size prior to 1921 was about 1,600 hectares. Well, that's not the case today in that landscape. Mean fire level is about 47 years. And this is kind of the historic patch frequency distribution. We had a lot of small fires, not a lot of big fires. And those small fires basically broke up the landscape. They changed the contagion on the landscape. A lot of small fires basically breaks up big fires. And we've looked at that in the context of some recent research that we're working on in Northwest Washington, Idaho, and in Kootenai National Park, BC. A research program that we're just wrapping up now. We're looking at the influence of past burn mosaics on future fire spread. So how long do these past burn scars impede fire flow in the landscape? And how effective are they at that? Do they impact fire size, but also fire severity? And we found that for the most part, they do. This is East Central Washington. This is Lake Chelan right here. And this is just all the fire activity in the last 15 years. But there's not a lot of overlap. They keep running into these past burn scars and stopping. So there's lessons to be learned from that. We go back to the tripod fire here. It ran into these old fires and stopped, but there's a lot of green patches in here. So why were these patches green? Why did they not burn? When we went back out and looked at a bunch of these sites to see what was going on. So we had some of these which were, classic restoration resilience treatments where we thinned the forest and understory burned them, and they survived quite well. This is the Forks Fire, 1970, and a fire slammed into that on a hot burnable day and it didn't burn. It's because it was a reburn site. It burnt once, probably back in 1950, and it reburned again in 1970. And as you can see, there's just no fuel, so it doesn't carry a fire. It impedes fire flow in the landscape. We also had forests that impeded fire flow. So this was a 120-year-old lodgepole pine stand, a nice mature pine stand, but you walk through that stand and there's no surface fuel. You'll find little chunks of black charred bits of wood. Well, that's a stand that burnt, and then it reburned, and then it grew a forest. And that's basically an asbestos forest. The tripod fire slammed into that on a really hot, burnable day. There were 30-mile-an-hour winds. RH was about 5%, and temperature was 35 Celsius. And it wouldn't burn it because there's no fuel. And we also have, classic example of clear-cut patches that were slash burned way back in the day and replanted, and they all survived. So we have a lot of really good clues as to what we can do in that landscape to mimic nature and create these hedges to fire flow. And some of these actually carry a pretty good period of inflammability based on some of the research we've looked at. A reburn site, anywhere from 5 to 15 years, and in some cases, these patches will stay unburnable for 40 years, and they'll slowly regrow a forest. These patches, anywhere from 40 to 120 years. And if we can actually get closed stands of healthy aspen and other hardwoods, we can buy, good 40 to 80 years. So these are some of the, basically, Mother Nature's tools out there that we have to look seriously at. And of course, scale is a big part of it, but also where they occur. So this is back to some of that caribou research again. And they looked at, basically how many fires had reoccurred on the same site. So red indicates that fires occurred there multiple times. Dark green was just a single fire or no fire over that recording period. And they found that there were places where fire just didn't go, and chances are it was topographically driven. There were steep, cool aspects, northerly aspects, but there were also, conversely, there were places where fire went every time. If there was a fire in that landscape, it was going to burn that patch again and again and again. So if we can actually redo that and determine where that is, it makes sense to put our most vulnerable things, our resources, in places where they're not likely to burn, and write off some of these places where they're just going to reburn every single time. Like, don't go replant this. It's not going to survive the next fire. And a big part of this is thinking about fire as a contagion. And we mimic medical science in this. It's if we have a very, very susceptible or vulnerable or contagious population, fire will go the full lengths of that population. It'll go everywhere. But if we can actually start to make that landscape less vulnerable or less susceptible, then we can start to hedge in fire. And we can use percolation theory to do some of that research to determine how much of that landscape needs to be in these unburnable patches. And how do they move over time, space and time, so that we can actually break up fire flow. We're not going to stop all fires in the future. The conditions that we're given in the summertime, the few resources we have for fighting fire, we're not going to stop a lot of fires. But we can actually impede fire flow and arrest some of that. The question is, how much of that landscape needs to be in that unburnable or less flammable condition? And to rebuild resilience, our treatments need to be in the right places. So we can learn from science on that. Our treatments have to be intense enough so that they're actually taking enough fuel out of the woods. And most importantly, our treatments have to be of the scale of the disturbance. If we have 10,000 hectare fires, we have to have 10,000 hectare treatment areas. 40, 50, 100 hectares is not going to work when we have 10,000, 20,000 hectare fires. It's going to blow right through them like they don't even exist. And we have to maintain these treatments. When we do a treatment once, we're not done. We have to keep at it. And we have a lot of tools in the toolbox when it comes to this. We can do mechanical thinning, prescribe burning with and without thinning. We can use natural ignitions, and we can manage those things. We can herd fire across the landscape. Some of those patches that are basically in fire sheds and fire pathways, we just make them fire containers. We're going to steer fire to those things, and basically we're going to keep them there. But we also have to look at forest type and structure as something that moves across the landscape and is not static, because it's not working. A lot of our static reserves, we're losing them rapidly. And historically, chances are they moved across the landscape. So in summary, and it's depressing, but climate change is going to give us longer, more severe fire seasons. It's going to have a big impact on society, the environment, and the economy. The solution is we've got to look at reducing potential fire behavior in a big, big way across a large part of the landscape. And we have to be stronger advocates. We have a very limited window to turn this thing around. If things continue the way they're going, we're not going to have much of a forest industry in this province. We're not going to have a lot of forest in this province. So we don't have, a minister telling us we need to try a pilot for 5 years. Like, no, we need to get doing stuff right now. We need to do it in a big way. And I just encourage everyone to just be a stronger advocate. If policy is not going in the right direction fast enough, then get on the horn and get a hold of your elected officials and tell them to giddy up. That's it.
And there is time for questions.
I noticed you didn't really talk much about addressing the source of fire starts and the large proportion that are anthropogenic. And is that because that's just like spitting in the wind and it's really going to not make much difference? Are there any examples of jurisdictions that have really tried to use, enforcement and penalties to impact that, and it's just not worth it?
A lot of people certainly try that. They try pretty hard with mixed success.
Yeah.
I saw some statistics from just in California, and the last month and a half they've had 1,500 fire starts. And this time of year, the Santa Ana season is not lightning. These are human. In fact, these two fires, Camp and Wolves, are both caused by down power lines, which is human caused. So we have we have to break out human caused fires, anthropogenic fires, into what are really truly accidents. They're just bad luck. You park your car on the grass, you got a catalytic converter, and you didn't realize you started a fire. But tossing a cigarette out is a whole other matter. But jurisdictions have really tried hard. California is looking at, do they bury the power lines? They're actually looking at cutting down power during certain periods when they have strong Santa Anas forecasted. But everyone's trying some of that and not a lot of success. But then again, last year we had 30% human-caused fires and 70% lightning. So if we stopped all human-caused fires, we'll make an impact, but we're never going to do that.
There are some hydro experiments where they're actually using insulated transmission wire. It works in two ways. It saves the shorting out, but it also increases the movement of power. It cuts the fields down, which, take a fair amount of power to sustain. If they insulate the wire, then that field is cut down and you don't get a lot of the same power.
Well, I think PG&E will be looking seriously at, well, there's talk that they may be bankrupt on this one. This is we're up to 59 fatalities now and 10,000 structures. So PG&E maybe, and Cal Edison was the power line on the Woolsey fire. So, but if you looked at the upfront cost of insulating that and vegetation management versus the lawsuit at the end, it always makes more sense to put money into mitigation, but we never do that.
Okay, so just so I understand correctly, you're mentioning to kind of replicate that historic mosaic landscape to try and mitigate how far a fire can go. We're trying to break it up a bit. You mentioned something about treatment and taking out the potential fuel of an area that's been burned already, and that a large burn would require a large treatment. Do you have to take all the fuel out of that burn, or is there a size that you could take out that could allow some of that area to burn again and then still act as a mosaic to break up
Oh,
that
for sure.
big burn?
Yeah, we don't take all the fuel out. That's not feasible in a lot of cases, and we still have to figure out how we're going to do those large treatment units too. So, but reducing the fuel certainly, and especially if we want to try to revegetate, grow that site with a contour forest. So if we can reduce the large fuels on it, then we can actually, build some resilience into that stand again. But if we leave it back full of large fuels, then we're right out.
So just to follow up on that last question, you're talking about these large treatment areas of thousands of hectares. You mentioned 10,000 hectares. How would you go about,
That's an experiment.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
very costly as well.
Yeah, so we're a group of us are involved in a very large project with the Quesnel Timber Supply Area, 1.3 million hectares west of the Fraser, and that area is being established as an incubator, both for the forest product side as well as the ecological side. And our first stage is trying to understand those historic patterns and processes in the landscape, and then reestablishing those within a simulation framework, and then adding climate change projections to it, and getting an idea of how big do those treatments need to be, how big are those fires going to be, how big are the outbreaks going to be as far as bark beetles. And then from that will come those serious discussions about how do we do it then. And we'll be looking at a trade-off analysis of what are the impacts on timber, carbon, wildlife habitat, and all that kind of stuff. So right now it's a hypothesis, but we do know that our treatments do have to be of similar scale as the disturbances until we can get those disturbance sizes down. Stay tuned.
I imagine that the forestry industry is probably getting fairly serious now about this stuff. So what is their response been to all this work?
Well, so we're working with West Fraser on this one, and they're scared to death. They have significant investments. Quesnel is probably the most timber-dependent community in the province. They've got a lot of really high-class production facilities there, but they're significantly worried about the timber supply. And but they've embraced this as something we have to learn. We have to figure this thing out going forward. Chances are, and I was talking with Lachlan about this, is that we may be looking at a whole different profile to the industry and the profile of the wood supply. If we look at our forest management or plantation management from a risk perspective, if we have that site that's been burnt and we salvage it and reburn it, and then we establish a forest, we buy 5 to 15 to 20 years. And then that forest will grow and we'll close the canopy, and then we're going to buy another 40 or 50 years. We're going to have that closed lodgepole pine stand with no surface fuel. And then disturbance will start to have an effect. It will break up the canopy and more fuels will come down. We'll get a few more grasses and herbs and fine fuels. Well, that may be the time to harvest. We may be harvesting stands when they start to come into a risk profile versus harvesting stands when they come into a culmination of mean annual increment profile. So we may be looking at forest management where it's mostly based on how do we hedge against risk and losing the investment. And that means, what do you do with lodgepole pine that may be this big or maybe this big? So that's a lot of the work the industry is going to have to do, is to figure out what can we do with this stuff. Also, they lost 115,000 hectares of plantations in 2017. Well, you're going to walk away from all that fiber. Is there stuff that we can do with it? Can we use it for bioenergy, or can we do something with it? So a lot of those discussions are ongoing right now, trying to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, just following up on this piece, in terms of fuel treatments, when you look at, especially, west of the Fraser and Quesnel, we've had some pretty large harvested areas in upwards of tens of thousands of hectare size of opening, which are essentially large fuel treatments. Has anyone kind of thought or looked at those and how effective or ineffective they were at managing, at dealing with the fires that we've had in the last couple of years?
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's a huge.
Yeah, we haven't. This is one of the areas where because of our lack of research dollars, we haven't been able to jump on that sort of thing. It's something we do need to do. We need to understand what's happened the last couple of years that's beneficial and what's happened that can guide management that wasn't so beneficial. So with some of those large treatment areas that have burnt, and some of them have burnt twice now, and what's the fuel load condition in those things right now? And we don't have that information. We were lucky enough to get research dollars that we could look at that in our 3 case study areas, the Tripod Fire in the East Zone Complex in Idaho and the Cooney Fire in BC. But we need to do that research across large parts of BC where we now have had these large fires. Is what fuel or force conditions impeded fire flow and what ones didn't. We don't have that. We desperately need it to guide management. If those big patches did function as fire breaks, that's where we invest our money in regeneration. But if we've got areas that burnt and we didn't salvage it, we probably shouldn't be planting those just yet.
Yeah, I think more of my question was like, we had large areas of clear cut harvest that really had almost no fuel in them. And yet that's kind of what's almost being proposed in terms of future treatments again. And I wonder if that is really, we've actually been over the last 15, 20 years, we've been doing that at a fairly extensive scale, which is one of the reasons we have a wood supply issue in the province. And I wonder if that's really, looking at replicating that again will actually buy us very much.
Yeah, it's hard to say. We'd have to take a look at what the fuel conditions are in those clear cut blocks. And it doesn't have to necessarily be big 10,000 hectare blocks, but it has to be enough treated area that actually impedes fire flow.
You mentioned that the forested area in the province will decrease over time. And is there any silver lining to this, like historic grassland areas being restored, or will those historic grassland areas just end up full of the weed that burns all the time, like you mentioned?
Cheatgrass?
Yeah, cheatgrass.
Well, luckily cheatgrass hasn't spread too far north of the Okanagan, I think. There's a little bit in the East Kootenays, but you could answer this better.
Southern Barrett.
Southern Barrett, yeah. If we haven't got really high burn severity, meaning soil impacts, with an adjacent weed supply nearby, then hopefully a lot of native plants will be established on the site. But if we do have really high burn severity and there's a good thriving population of weeds close by, then the weeds tend to take advantage of those sites pretty good.
There's an old phrase that goes something to the effect that if you find yourself in a hole in trouble, that you should probably stop digging. And I think that pertains specifically to forest practices, the way things are going now. Back in the 50s, and I think it's an ongoing program in Ontario, there were fire test patches that they would burn. And they would have coniferous patches and a deciduous patch, and a coniferous patch and a deciduous patch. They would light the one coniferous patch, and it would burn like crazy, and it would go 10 feet into the deciduous patch and stop. The logging companies today, number one, they're trying to kill the deciduous forest by spraying it with glyphosate so their bloody pine trees will grow better. But they're creating these monoculture forests, which are wide open and far more volatile than any deciduous forest ever could be. I have been thinking for years that maybe the whole idea of the way they're actually cutting these clear cut areas. Number one, stop clear cutting if you can. Do a selective cut, that sort of thing. But do it in strips. And when you cut an area of coniferous tree or pine trees or whatever, you replant it with a large percentage of deciduous trees if you can get them to grow. That means that if you get a fire started in one of the coniferous strips, it may only go as far as this area where you replanted. And it just seems that they're making things worse. Now, there are curtailments, there are things that are in the wind now to stop the spraying of this glyphosate. But the fact is that when you spray a forest with glyphosate, you kill everything deciduous, which means that everything that lives on those things, like all of them, the mammals, all the deer, all the moose, all the beaver, all die, period. And your forest then becomes a monoculture forest, which is open to disease, it's open to fire, it's open to all kinds of things. Those ideas have to somehow, we're just gonna stop those kind of practices.
Yeah, we've had some good discussions within our working group about growing more deciduous in the landscape. And up in that neck of the woods, it's both birch and aspen. And there's people are definitely warming to that idea. So, and
It only took 50 years.
yeah, I know it's been a slog, but we're finally coming around to that. And the thing is that those deciduous patches have to be large enough that their internal conditions are high relative to high moisture and low temperature. They can't be too small, otherwise they'll have similar conditions to conifers. Again, this summer there were examples of where the fires in the north around Fort St. James actually hit pure deciduous in the south. And I fought fire in the States, and we use those patches as safety zones.
Yes, absolutely. We did that case as well.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about the economics of it, you had numbers for like suppression costs with fires, or like the direct costs, not associated with the aftermath. Is there do you happen to have any idea of even just a rough like dollar for dollar ratio of the suppression versus like these treatments that you're considering? So for a 10,000 hectare fire, what would be the cost of a 10,000 hectare treatment relative?
We don't, but there's actually a fair bit of published literature on that. So they've looked at the cost of treatment versus the cost of suppression, and the cost of wildfires, and the treatments are always much
Is
cheaper.
that even when you're just considering the direct, like the cost of firefighting versus the cost of the prescribed burning or whatever?
Yeah, our prescribed burn costs are typically much less than the wildfire costs. Size and economics of scale are a big part of it. If we can do larger units, then they're always a lot cheaper than smaller units. But a lot of that research has been done and published.
So thanks for a really good presentation. I'm just wondering, how do some of your ideas fit in with things like the federal provincial forest carbon initiative, stocking standards, things like that, which are all about sequestering in carbon into trees, which seem to be somewhat unprotected. There's very little thought being given in, say, that program. There's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to pound more trees in the ground, but not to protect them. So is there discussions with people like yourself and others?
Yeah, we have on our project team, we've got Werner Kurtz involved in that. And Werner works for NRCan at the Pacific Forestry Center, Victoria, and he's one of the best carbon modelers. Well, we recognize that what we have to do in this analysis is a true trade-off analysis. If we do a status quo, follow the forest carbon protocol and just plant trees everywhere, what's the impact on the carbon budget? And we probably recognize right now, as you're suggesting, is that we're going to have a boom and bust carbon cycle. We're going to plant a bunch of trees, we're going to have fires, we're going to emit tons of carbon. And what we should probably work toward is a carbon cycle that is a little bit more like this and not like this. We're gonna have some sites where we're gonna be sequestering carbon. We're gonna have some sites where we're gonna be emitting carbon. But it's not gonna be this massive boom and bust system. And we need to figure out what that is. Right now, we don't have great data on carbon stores. When we talk to the carbon modelers, it's like, well, so what fuel bed conditions are you using to model carbon? It's like, well, we're using the 16 benchmark, fuel types, and someone developed some default numbers for fuel loading. It's okay. Well, so how much was consumed in that fire? Well, we're going to estimate, 10 or 15%. Well, that's not really good enough. So we need better fuel bed models that actually are linked solidly to how much carbon's out there, and then how much is being consumed in these fires. So we've been having those discussions, and we're definitely looking the same way. But it's difficult because Ottawa is throwing millions of dollars at this. There's 350 million seedlings that have been sown, and like I said, some of these sites have been planted 3 and 4 times. So
All with coniferous trees.
all with lodgepole pine mostly. So we're just kind of throwing good money out the window. I shouldn't have said that, but.
Well, thanks for a great presentation. I was just, you're saying a lot of what we have to do is really political will. And so that means we really have to educate the public. But it's kind of a hard sell. You do things like prescribed fire, people want to protect trees. How do we go about educating the public and raising awareness so that they're on side with more fuel management, prescribed burns, right? Right now, if you have prescribed fire, we do less than we ever, so how do we get past those challenges to kind of move forward?
That's a great question. I think there's a good openness and willingness right now to look at some of these ideas. We always talk about the fact we have a big bad fire season. We've got like a 2-year window to get the public on side. Well, I think the public's there. It's just that we need to be out there engaging with the public. Like I said, I did this talk in Penticton 10 days ago for the First Things First group in Penticton, and it was mostly senior citizens, but there was 150, 200 people there, and they were engaged. And I talked about the fact that you live in a fire environment. You have to accept the landscape needs to change. It's going to change. We're likely going to have more smoke in the air, and you need to get on the backs of your politicians and say that you're not moving fast enough on this. And we didn't get any naysayers. I've got a number of other talks and presentations I have to do, and I'm not anticipating a lot of pushback. We have in the past, but 6 weeks of living through the smoke and people are scared. People are honestly quite scared. There was an article, CBC posted it 10 days ago, and it was about the ecological depression. And it's those of us who have been following the science and listening and understanding what's going on here, recognizing that it's pretty scary out there, the direction things are going in. And we have a limited window to kind of turn things around. But I think people are hungry to do something. They just don't know what. And that goes as far as governments too.
We got to start thinking about wrapping this up. So maybe a couple more questions because I still see maybe Rob.
Just gonna ask a question about fuel management. When you're talking about removing, say, downwood from a particular area, do you distinguish by decay classes? Recognizing the older ones should be holding more moisture, than the younger ones.
Yeah, and there's also the economics of what we can actually do. So fuel removal it's best done during the harvest pass, and you grab as much as you can and you bring it into a landing. You leave the tops and the small branches and stuff, and you leave the larger logs because they have a function out there. But in general, we've left way too much slash out there, and we need to do a better job of bringing more of it in. And we need to understand the consequences of whatever we do leave out there. So if we need to understand how much is too much. So right now we have, within the Wildfire Act, we have fire risk levels. And it's not based so much on the ecological consequences of leaving the fuel out there. It's based on difficulty to control a fire. So can a crew with hand tools and chainsaws cut their way through this and create a guard? Or do we need dozers? When our risk rating in our Wildfire Act should be based on the ecological consequences if this fuel bed burns. And that's going to shift the discussion. It's going to shift the practices too. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it gets it. I'm wondering if you have like a ballpark cubic meters per hectare. I mean, Sweden runs like 3 cubic meters.
5 tons per hectare. 5 tons per hectare is about where we should be left at. And that might be 1 log, and it might be 100 logs. Preferably 1 log.
I've been promised that this is a very quick question, and I know
Swear
that.
mine is quick.
All right.
Answer that.
Okay.
Like when you say tons, do you mean CO2 or like?
Tons of wood. Yeah, metric tons.
Yeah, you mentioned the cost in terms of suppression cost, and I guess the elements were economic costs or human impact costs. infrastructure and health, etc. Has there been any studies on the cost of losing the ecosystem services that these forests provide? Or like those substances stuff, I guess, ecological economics.
People have tried to monetize that for sure. And there's a couple papers that have been written on that.
On forest fires,
Yes. And the impacts on,
that would be even much bigger than.
it is. Yeah. I wish I could think of the author, but there are some papers on that. They've tried to monetize whatever
Because
they're
if you
doing.
present that also to the public, then they'll see the cost much higher than what you can.
Yeah. Actually, so in 2015, there was a large fire called the Rim Fire in California, and it burnt in the Sierra Nevadas on the west side, actually north of where the campfire is now. And the critical thing with that area was that it's also provides water supply to San Francisco. And there was a report issued, and I think that one was about a $1.2 billion impact on hydrologic quality and quantity and infrastructure damage, possibly to the reservoirs. But they also did try to monetize some of those ecological services and values. It's the difficulty with this is that it's one study over here that looks at human health effects. It's another study over here. It's not all on the same fire season. So what you're doing is you're sort of going, well, this fire, which was in the Drayton Valley, which the University of Calgary Medical School had done some study on, put the human health effects at $10 million. So you're trying to pull together the information that you can to try to get a bigger picture of what these fires cost and where do the costs lie. I mean, we looked at some of the stuff, and at a provincial level, it affects almost every ministry. Every ministry takes a whack on their budget due to something associated with these fires. But we don't have all the numbers. So it's hard to get the real numbers on it. But for other natural disturbances, we do have the numbers. So, but not fire, which is, need more researchers.
Golden, is it quick? Maybe you can come and ask Bob afterwards then. All right, thanks so much, Bob.